So I know as we prepare for worship and services on a Sunday morning, we're supposed to enter into it with reverence and a sober mind. But just to illustrate what my mind's thinking about when I'm sitting on the front row, looking at some of Mitchell's trinkets up here, I can't help myself. Don't know if you can see this in the back, but that's me in the morning when I get out of bed. That's literally what crossed my mind. And then you got this guy. Let me see this snake. See that in the back?
That's your white one. He ain't gonna say that.
That was my reaction to Mitchell when he asked me to preach this morning. I can't help it. I love Mitchell. Now, having said all that, I want to thank the elders for the opportunity to speak today. No, I do mean that. It's an honor, and I appreciate that. And we do care about Mitchell a lot. For those of you who are visiting with us, or those with whom I've not made your acquaintance in the last month or two, I'm not Mitchell. I'm the fill-in. Mitchell is our regular pulpit preacher, and he's away this weekend advancing himself with more training, more credentials. We have a superhero for a preacher. He can do swift water rescue, deep water rescue, tall building rescue. It doesn't matter. He can rescue. So I say that a little tongue in cheek, but seriously, he's well trained. He does a lot of things I can't imagine doing. To be honest, I don't think you could pay me to do some of the things he trains himself to be able to do as an EMT and also in the world of emergency rescue, and we're proud of him. I'm proud that for a guy that most of his peers would be looking at retirement or slowing down, and he's still going strong. You know, he's advancing himself and learning, and that's something all of us should be doing. And I want to thank Gayla too for her work, his work here at the church. Carol Ann and I have a soft spot for preachers and their families, and particularly here for Mitchell and Gayla. Those are hard shoes to fill. It's a thankless job sometimes. They do a lot that nobody knows about. Sometimes preachers and their wives catch lots of criticism, and I'm not saying we're critical of them here, but you know how it is, and we just need to let them know that we appreciate them very much for all that they do. If you're visiting with us, I hope you can find a home here at our congregation. We're a family like any other. We squabble some and pick at each other, but at the end of the day, we love each other, and we love our Lord, and we love our church. And if you're new to our group, hopefully someone around you will greet you before the morning's over, maybe as you're leaving, and make you feel at home here, because we do want you to be here and to worship with us. We need to pray for our spring breakers that are still traveling back. We've got a good crowd this morning. A few blank spots around. I know some faces are missing. I know some people may still be in the air or on the roads. We get back to reality tomorrow, I think, in the school system, but we need to pray for those who are traveling and trying to get back home. I, as many of you, have watched the news out of Ukraine on a daily basis, and I've watched it with a lot of mixed feelings: anger, frustration, despair, horror. I mean, there's just a long list of emotions that go through as you see all of that stuff coming across the television, and it can be overwhelming. You have an overwhelming desire to try to do something. I mean, that's one of my first reactions. I can't suit up and go join the mercenaries that are flowing in to help the Ukrainian regulars fight and do all that they're doing, but then you think, well, I could help. I could help with the humanitarian aid or help with refugees, and you watch all the volunteers going and doing and see what's happening. On a footnote to that, I would say, and Mitchell could speak more to that when he gets back, there are things you can do. I know the church where our kids and their spouses and our grandkids go, Otter Creek in Nashville, they just wrapped up one of what will be several humanitarian drives, aid drives with responsible organizations that make sure the aid and the money and everything gets to the right people to do the most good that it can do. Even the little church down at Eastland where my dad preaches, we were talking about it, and they sponsor missionaries in Ukraine one couple in particular that they're very close to, and you've heard these stories. It's like Mitchell told of some of his family, but they are a spiritual family, if you will, but they had to literally flee. They fled. They finally got across the border in Poland. And these are people, folks, just like me and you. These are our Christian brothers and sisters that would normally be sitting in an assembly in Kiev or Lviv or somewhere else having church, just like we're doing here, that have lost everything, and having to flee. And that really strikes close to home. You start thinking about the fact that these are people in many ways, just like you and me, with daily routines, family, friends, social lives, all of which have been torn to shreds and obliterated by a madman in Russia. And I sometimes think about, my life, my home, and where my family lives and where my friends live. And I go to work in the same building I've been going to work to forever. And if I'm sick, the doctor's office is across the way. And if I'm worse than that, the hospital's down the street. And if I need something for the farm, I go to the co-op, right? If I've had a long week at work, you're probably likely to find me at Forte's on the square on a Friday night or a Saturday night. But just imagine having all of that gone in a matter of days. Gone as in destroyed. Your home's blown up. You can't go to work. If you're sick, there's no doctors around. The hospital's bombed. You don't go out and eat anymore. You don't engage in those social relationships, and you spend most of your nights and a big part of your day down in subway stations or subway tunnels or the basements of those high-rises. It's hard to imagine. And it leaves you feeling helpless and frustrated to see the injustice and the breakdown, to try to make sense out of some of that. I can't figure all that out this morning, but that's the backdrop for a lot of thoughts that I had, because as you look in history, you don't have to go far back in history, but you see corollaries for what's happening. You see dictators, you see totalitarians, you see greedy nations, you see those who will exploit and destroy others for the sake of empire, for the sake of greed, for the sake of wealth, for the sake of power, that don't care about the butchery, they don't care about the savagery, they don't care about everything else that's going on. And you can even look in the Bible and see the same thing prophetically. And that's what I want to do with a few minutes this morning. If you go to the book of Nahum, some of you say Nahum, Nahum, it's just three little chapters. You could sit down and read that in just a few minutes. I sometimes kid, it's on page 1084 in my Bible, but most of us don't know where Nahum is, but Nahum's one of the minor prophets. You look in your index there in the front, you'll find him, or look on your iPhone, iPad, you'll find him. There are some prophetic corollaries. There's some lessons here, and I want to draw those lessons out of Nahum. Nahum of Elkosh. We only know about two things regarding this guy. Number one, we know his name. His name was Nahum. We know where he was born. He was born in Elkosh. And we know that he's the seventh of the 12 prophets that we have near the end of the Old Testament. His name means comfort or compassion. And the bottom line is, it's comfort to God's people that God, acting through the world, will destroy the oppressor of God's people, which at this time in this book, he's talking about the Assyrians and their capital at Nineveh. And God's people needed encouragement because they were being oppressed. They were being killed. They were being invaded. They were being conquered, if you will, by the Assyrian armies. And the book of Nahum was written just before the fall of Nineveh. And it's written to give comfort and courage to God's people, to let them know that their oppressor, the Assyrians, are going to go away because God's about to destroy Nineveh. Nahum was a contemporary of Jeremiah. We know about him. And he was removed just a little bit in time from Zephaniah and Habakkuk. And what he's talking about throughout the book is the fall of Nineveh, but it's the cry of outraged humanity and victory over an enemy. That's what it's all about. And I'm not trying to say that God will destroy Putin to the relief of the Ukrainians as he did Nineveh and Assyria to the relief of Judah. But I think if you look at what he talks about in Nahum, you can draw some parallels, some important parallels, not only to what we see in the news, but to our nation today. And the first thing you see, if you're taking notes, is the power of God. The power of God. Something we forget in this world is that God rules in the kingdoms of men. God rules in the kingdoms of men. You know, we have an important thing, probably the second most important story in the news right now, at least in our nation, is the nomination of a new Supreme Court justice. And that's the big deal. That's an important deal. I won't get into all the politics of that, or who you favor, who you don't favor, or what what your ideas on any of that would be. I would say this. Jesus in his teachings and Paul in his teachings both tell us that we are to respect the judicial structures that order our civility, the way we live our lives. I would also say that our judicial system's not perfect, but in my opinion, it's the best we've got in the world, I think, or among the very best. I wouldn't trade it. But we get so bogged down in arguing about who's going to control, how are they going to vote, what laws are they going to pass, what laws will be enforced, will these laws be upheld? And we forget at the end of the day, at the bottom line of all of it, God's in charge. We can pass all the laws we want, but it's God's laws that matter. And that's what you see in Nahum. That's what you see in the way God dealt with Nineveh. They forgot who was in charge. Despite Nineveh's power, God controlled all things. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria for 100 years. It was fortified. Sennacherib fortified it, built it up, built defenses, built waterworks, restored the temples. I mean, it was a big cosmopolitan city. It was a happening place of its day. Powerful army at that time. And it was easy, even like we do in our nation today, it's easy to feel confident in what? Confident in our power, confident in our economic wealth, confident in our abilities, confident in who we are. And a lot of that's well placed. But be careful what happens. If you go by, and if you were in our classes on the minor prophets there a year or two ago, we talked about a lot of this. But if you go by the place where Nineveh existed today, it's two big piles of dirt, two mounds or tells, T-E-L-S, where you had one village or city built on top of another, and Nineveh ultimately was built on top of those, and then it got destroyed. It's located across the Tigris River from Mosul in Iraq. If you go to Iraq today, you could go see these mounds. And you know what's on the site of where Nineveh existed 2,400 years ago? A municipal water tank that got blown up in the Iraqi war, a cemetery, and basically what amounts to a garbage dump. Do you think the people, the Ninevites that lived back then at the time that Nahum was prophesying, would have believed you if you had told them that? What would exist? Even 200 years after the destruction of Nineveh, a Greek general and his army were marching through the area, and they never knew the place existed. The walls were dust. The waterworks were gone. The temples were dust. Destroyed. And there's a big lesson in there for those who would challenge the power of God. The history of the world is the judgment of the world. Nations mete out judgment against nations. Nations reap what they sow, and the wages of sin is death. And the bottom line is Nahum is a book of relevance in a world of dictators. Number two, you see the protection of God. The protection of God. Israel and Judah needed protection from the Assyrian war machine desperately. They couldn't do it any other way. There's a parallel there in a way. You look at the Ukrainians today, they need help. A lot of it. And a lot of it's being given, but they wouldn't have a chance without NATO, the United States, and its allies providing them with all of this help. One of the most famous verses, and a lot of people don't even realize it comes out of Nahum. If you look in chapter 1, verse 7, we quote this, we talk about it. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that trust in him. God is a stronghold in troublesome times. You see all the negative in the world. One thing that helps what you see, you watch what's going on in Eastern Europe, or even make it more fundamental than that. There's very few people that haven't lost someone due to COVID. You look around the congregation, many of you have lost relatives, some of them very close. You've lost friends. I've lost friends and clients. You know, I get sick of the politics around that. Really, I don't want to hear about anybody's political views about COVID. All I care about, you know, my good friend in Van Buren County died with it. And my good client over in Warren County died with it. And you've got family members and others did too. A lot of people are still mourning. But you know, God's a stronghold in troublesome times. You see inflation go up. Gas prices go up. Most of us don't even feel this, but there are some people out there, a few people out there, a lot more than we realize, who can't get to work because they can't afford enough gas to put in their tank to get to work. And that's tough. This church needs to be finding people like that and helping them, finding ways to reach out in our community. But the second thing that gives me comfort is God is a stronghold in times of trouble. You know, when you look back through history, you look at the Assyrian armies, you look at Nineveh, their atrocities were well known. And they're preserved in art and architecture. You can go to London right now to the British Museum. You can go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and you can see carvings. You can see records inscribed in stone that are now in these museums on display of the Assyrian armies carrying away captives that were set up 2,000 years ago, 2,400 years ago to try to illustrate to anybody who might challenge them how powerful they are. Just like we fly the flag or we have our objects or symbols of power in our nation today. They did too, and it was carved in stone, and we have that stuff today. They were a great nation, but they were an atrocious nation. But they couldn't protect the people around them. Nineveh saw men and nations as tools to be exploited, to gratify the lust of their conquest and the lust of their commercialism. They didn't exist to serve mankind. They destroyed Israel, 722 BC. They subjugated Judah, 735 BC. I was thinking through that divided kingdom history when I was reading through this yesterday, and I can remember as a kid in the little country church at Eastland again, having to memorize the kings of the divided kingdoms. And if you put a gun to my head right now, I couldn't do that. And I was kind of embarrassed. In fact, I was trying to see if I could recite the minor prophets in order last night. I couldn't do that either. And just another footnote to everything I'm saying, we need to pay more attention to the education of our kids. And we do a great job in this church, better than a lot of churches I know. But, I remember Michael smiling at me back there. When I was a kid, Michael, my dad had us memorizing the Bible encyclopedia. You had to know your kings and your books and the kings of the divided kingdom and the prophets and the judges and, on and on and on you go. We need that Bible knowledge. Why? You think Peter's going to ask you at the gate, who was the third king of Judah and whatever? No, that's not what I'm saying. But we take for granted what we have. You may not always be able to look it up in a book. If Mitchell were trying to preach from his iPad in Kiev right now, he'd have a problem. It wouldn't work. I'm just picking on him as an example. I'm just saying, things don't always stay the same. We need that knowledge. Okay? We need to embed it in our memories, embed it in our experiences, in what we do. God brought judgment against them, and that brings me to the next, probably most powerful verse in this whole book. It occurs in two places, chapter 2, verse 13, and chapter 3, verse 5. When God, talking about Nineveh, he says, "Behold, I'm what? I am against thee." I'm reading out of the King James Version, not for doctrinal reasons. It's just what I grew up with, and I'm used to it. So we put it in modern terms. I'm against you. Who wants to hear those words from God? We examine our lives. I'm not perfect. I don't say anything up here as somebody who's got it all figured out, because I don't. Now, somebody asked me one time, what would I feel like when God comes again? Am I going to be overjoyed in jubilation? What will the experience be? I don't know, but I got a feeling, and this may just be my personal thing, maybe my own personal hang-up, but I don't think it's going to be me running toward him with open arms. I'm going to be on my face asking for mercy. Because I know God's a just God. And I know I don't come close to meeting that standard I need to meet. And the only way that any of that's made right is by God's grace. And I understand all of that. But I think, and it's not a popular thing to talk about nowadays, but we forget about God's justice. We forget about God's judgment. We know He's a patient God, but we forget that there's an end to His patience. God brought judgment against Assyria. He said, and He told them in these two places that we just recited, I'm against thee, I'm against you. And that downfall came swiftly. Nineveh was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then the Medes, and then the Scythians. It was all over with. And there was nothing left but a garbage heap and a cemetery and a broken down water tank now in our modern times. It's not there anymore. Which brings me to number 3. We see the power of God, the protection of God, but we see the punishment of God, which again is not the one that's the most favorite one to talk about. Nobody can hide from God. You know, some people say, well, why, your immediate knee-jerk reaction, or some people's might be, man, we need to send our superior armies into Ukraine and we'll just beat that guy back, push him out, take care of business. That's what we need to do. And I admit to feeling that way. And I think one of the only reasons that that's not happening is because of the nuclear deterrent that Russia has. He's got his finger on a nuclear button. And that's a big, big, big deal. That's the undercurrent to everything that's going on right now. But you can't hide. You might be able to hide behind a nuclear button. You might be able to hide behind your own pride. You might be able to hide behind your own accomplishments. You might be able to hide behind your own man-made laws, but you won't hide from God. Amen. Nineveh incurred the wrath of God. The fall of Nineveh was carried out by her enemies, okay, but in reality, it was the judgment of God upon her sins, and that's what chapter 3 is all about. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Even though God is slow to anger, even though God is abundant in His loving kindness, as His action toward Nineveh in the book of Jonah shows, we'll talk about that in a minute, His long suffering should not be interpreted as indifference or a lack of power. God gave Nineveh a chance more than once. Psalm 34 verse 16, the face of the Lord is against evildoers to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. Yes, chapter 1, verse 7, God is a stronghold for those who trust in Him, no doubt. But He is a consuming fire to the unrighteous. How we behave, how we act, what we say, it matters. It matters here, it matters to our families, it matters to our church. You know, Satan doesn't have to come into this church and just start a lot of false doctrine and tear things up for us. All he's got to do is plant a little bit of greed in a heart over here, and a little bit of jealousy in a heart over here, and a little bit of vengeance in a heart over here, and a little bit of lust in a heart over here. We do the work for him. You let that stuff go to seed, you let it grow, and we're tearing ourselves apart. That's why living righteously is so important. That's, trying to live a pure life is so important. It's not like we're trying to earn our way into heaven. I know that doesn't work. I get that. It's to make us better people. It's to bring us closer to God. It's to help us to be better brothers and sisters with each other. It's to make stronger families. It's to keep us closer together. That's why all of that morality stuff is so important. And we need to pay attention to it. But yes, God is against the unrighteous. God's patience does not last forever. He is patient. We see the end of His patience. But if you go back, and this is kind of number 4, patience of God. Go back to Jonah, what He wanted Jonah to do, the prophecies of Jonah. God tried to help Nineveh. It didn't work. It didn't work. He tells us remember the city of No in the King James Version? I've lost my verse on that, but anyway, in Nahum, he says, Nineveh, you're going to be like that. See, it's Thebes that he's talking about in Lower Egypt. They thought they were invincible. They had the sea behind them. Who could attack them? They had Egypt as an ally to prevent anything like that from happening. But Nahum says, even they were destroyed. You're going to be the same way. He says, Nineveh is no more secure than ripe figs shaken from a tree. You know how ripe fruit is? Falls right off. When I was a little guy, we had apple orchards. My sister and I used to get into rotten apple fights. I know that sounds nasty, but we did. And, of course, you would got to be careful, because what loves rotten apples? Yellow jackets, hornets, all those things. Anyway, but they just fall right off the riper they get. And they say, Nineveh, you're the same way. Your end is near. So where do we put our security? God calls us to authenticity, honesty, transparency. But what do we put our faith in? What do we put our trust in? Do we place it in ourselves and our own ability to figure things out? Do we place it in our families? Do we place it in our laws? Do we place it in our country? I'm optimistic. I love our country, by the way. Sounds like I'm bashing it. I think our country could use a few prophecies right now. I'm optimistic about it, but guys, don't get comfortable that everything stays the same forever. Don't get comfortable that everything stays the same from day to day, because it doesn't. You may go your entire life and everything be fine, and you may not get past next week. Me neither. And with that in mind, where do you stand? Where's your security? Nineveh was mercifully treated by God and given numerous opportunities to repent, but God's patience does have an end. And in this world we're living in, this world is not my world. It doesn't belong to me. This world doesn't belong to our nation. This world really doesn't belong to any other nation. This world doesn't belong to President Biden. This world doesn't belong to President Trump. This world doesn't belong to Putin. It's God's world. It's God's world. And so I just ask you this, where do you stand with God? Because that's really the only thing that matters. So consider that question as we stand and sing.